He thought he owned her. Her name on the marriage certificate, her face in the family portraits, her silence at every dinner table where he held court like a king. For 5 years, Damian Volkov dressed her up, showed her off, and never once looked her in the eyes long enough to see what was living there. He was the most feared man in New York. She was his beautiful, quiet wife. That's what everyone believed. That's what he believed. But the most dangerous empires aren't built with guns and fear. They're built in silence. And the woman he spent 5 years humiliating was never who he thought she was. If this story hits you, hit like, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and follow, so you don't miss what happens when the most powerful man in the room finally realizes the throne was never his to begin with. Stay until the end. You won't see this ending coming. Isik. The penthouse sat 53 floors above the city, and on clear nights you could see the harbor from the master bedroom window, the black water catching the light of 1,000 buildings and throwing it back in broken pieces. Damian Volkov stood at that window every morning with his coffee and looked down at the city the way a man looks at something he believes he owns, which is to say, without gratitude, without wonder, only the dull satisfaction of possession. He was 41 years old, 6'2", the kind of physical presence that made rooms rearrange themselves around him. His hair had started going silver at the temples 2 winters ago, and he'd let it, because on him it looked like authority rather than age. He had the jaw of a man who had never once backed down from a fight, and the eyes of a man who had won most of them. His suits were Italian. His watch cost more than most people made in a year. His name, spoken in certain circles across the city, produced a specific and immediate reaction in people. A tightening around the eyes, a slight adjustment of posture, the involuntary recalculation of exits. Damian Volkov ran the most sophisticated criminal financial network on the eastern seaboard. He did not think of it as crime. He thought of it as architecture. You built structures. You reinforced load-bearing walls. You made sure the foundation never showed from street level. For 20 years he had been building, and what he had constructed was vast and intricate and, he believed, unassailable. He was wrong about that, but he wouldn't know it yet for another 4 days. This particular morning began like most mornings. He finished his coffee standing at the window. He reviewed the overnight financial summaries on a secured tablet. His head of operations, a quiet Georgian named Vasily, sent at 5 a.m. every day without exception. He showered, he dressed. He came into the kitchen and found his wife standing at the marble island with a glass of orange juice and a small leather notebook open in front of her, her pen moving in slow, deliberate strokes across the page. Serafina. She was 34, slender, dark-haired. She had the kind of stillness about her that some people mistook for emptiness, and other people, the more perceptive ones, recognized as something closer to a held breath. Her eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that changed with the light, and her hands, he noticed now and then, without registering the thought as significant, were always perfectly still unless she was writing. She looked up when he came in, gave him a small, neutral smile. "Morning," she said. "Is there coffee?" "It's made." He poured himself a cup and stood across the island from her, glancing down at the notebook. Her handwriting was small and precise, and he couldn't read it from where he stood, which had never interested him enough to try. "What's your day?" he said. It wasn't really a question. "Errands? A lunch? With who?" "Margaret, from the Arts Council." He made a sound that wasn't quite dismissal, but wasn't far from it. He had opinions about the women Serafina spent her time with. Mostly, he found them irrelevant. Charity volunteers, board members of organizations that spent more money on events than on whatever cause they ostensibly served. He had never said this to her directly, but he had communicated it through the particular quality of his silences on the subject. "I need you at the Hargrove dinner Thursday," he said. 8 o'clock. The car will be ready at 7:30. "I know, I have it. Wear the black Valentino." She didn't respond to that, just wrote something in her notebook. He watched her for a moment, that thin irritation moving through him that he couldn't quite locate the source of. It wasn't anything she'd done. It was something about the quality of her attention, the way she was never entirely present with him, never entirely absorbed, as though whatever she was actually thinking lived somewhere else entirely, in some room he had never been invited into. He finished his coffee and put the cup on the counter. "Vasily's car's at 7, he said. Don't let anyone into the building while I'm gone." "I never do." He left. The elevator took him down 53 floors. His driver was waiting on the street below. The city opened around him, gray and loud and already in motion, and Damian Volkov moved through it like a man who believed the world was arranged for his convenience, which, for most of his life, it had been. He did not look back up at the window. Had he looked, he would have seen his wife standing there, watching the car pull away, her orange juice untouched, her notebook closed, her expression carrying something he had never once thought to look for. Calculation. The Luminary Foundation Gala was 47 days away, and it was, in Damian's current strategic thinking, the most important room he needed to be inside this year. The gala was not merely a charity event, it was a convergence. Politicians who made decisions about zoning and contracts and regulatory attention. Billionaires who controlled capital flows across 3 continents. The kind of people whose handshakes in a coat room were worth more than signed agreements in boardrooms. Damian had attended twice before as a guest. This year he intended to attend as a title sponsor, which meant his name on the program, his name in the opening remarks, his name in the coverage the next morning. The title sponsorship required a donation of $8 million, which Damian had committed to 3 weeks ago through one of his legitimate holding companies, Volkov Capital Group. The problem presented itself at 9:15 that morning when Vasily walked into Damian's primary office on the 38th floor of a midtown building that officially housed a private equity firm and closed the door behind him with the specific care of a man carrying bad news he's already rehearsed. Vasily Orban was 52, built like someone had assembled him from spare industrial parts, and had been with Damian for 16 years. He was not prone to hesitation. "The Luminary Foundation called this morning," Vasily said. "There's a problem with the title sponsorship." Damian looked up from the documents on his desk. "What kind of problem?" "Someone outbid us." The office was quiet for a moment. "The sponsorship isn't a bid," Damian said, very carefully. "It's a commitment level. 8 million secures the title. We committed." "Someone donated 15 million. Vasily set a printed email on the desk. "Anonymous donor. Female benefactor," the foundation rep said. "They're calling it a transformational gift. The board voted to create a new designation, founding patron. Her name goes on the hall for 10 years. Damian looked at the email. He read it twice. Then he set it down and leaned back in his chair. "Who is she?" "The foundation won't release the name, anonymous donor protected by the terms of the gift." "Nothing is anonymous. I have Petrov working on it." Damian's jaw was tight. He could feel it, the specific tension that settled in his face when something happened that he had not anticipated and could not immediately control. He had learned over 20 years to keep his reaction internal in moments like this, to let the anger compress into something cold and dense rather than hot and visible. Hot anger made mistakes. Cold anger made decisions. "How did this happen without us knowing?" he said. "It moved fast. The donation was processed through a private foundation. The funds cleared in under 6 hours. Whoever this is, they have infrastructure. I want the name by end of week. Working on it. And I still want presence at the gala. Get me on the host committee. Call Fredericks at City Hall. He owes me 3 favors. Get it done." Vasily nodded and left. Damian sat in the quiet office and looked at the midtown skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows and felt the anger crystallizing in the way it did when something had been taken from him. It was not about the $8 million. Money was not the point. The point was that someone had seen his name attached to something and decided to place themselves above it. That was a statement. Anonymous or not, it was a statement, and statements required responses. He spent the rest of the morning in meetings. 2 in person, 3 by phone. By noon, he had cleared his schedule for the afternoon to focus on what Vasily was already calling the water situation. Meridian Water Technologies was an 18-month-old company operating out of a converted warehouse facility in Red Hook, Brooklyn. On paper, it was a clean tech startup developing proprietary filtration and desalination systems. In practice, it held 3 patents that represented the most significant advance in municipal water infrastructure technology in 40 years, and more importantly, it had secured letters of intent from 7 city governments across 3 continents. The contracts, once finalized, would be worth in excess of $3 billion. Damian wanted it. He had identified it 8 months ago through a financial analyst he kept on retainer specifically for spotting undervalued technology assets. He had spent the subsequent months doing what he always did, moving carefully, building leverage, positioning. The founder was a 30-year-old engineer named Caleb Mercer, who had more technical brilliance than business sense and who had burned through 2 rounds of venture funding faster than he should have. He needed capital. Damien had capital and a network of legitimate holding companies through which to funnel it. The deal was not yet closed, but it was, Damien believed, essentially done. He was reviewing the latest term sheet revision with his legal team that afternoon when his phone buzzed. It was a message from Petrov, his information specialist. 4 words. Working on it. Patience. Damien put the phone down. Patience was not, at this particular moment, something he had in significant supply. He came home at 7:30 that evening. The penthouse was lit warmly, and from the elevator he could smell something cooking, garlic, something herbed, the particular domestic smell that he had never decided how he felt about, whether it irritated him as a kind of theater or comforted him as a kind of constancy. Serafina was in the kitchen. She had changed from whatever she'd worn that day into dark slacks and a simple cream blouse, her hair pulled back, a glass of white wine on the counter beside her. She was moving through the kitchen with the quiet efficiency that characterized almost everything she did, and for a moment, standing in the doorway, Damien watched her without her knowing. He had married her 5 years ago because of what she represented as much as what she was. The Vale name was old money, the kind of money that had once been enormous and had then been managed, through a series of poor decisions and a brutal recession, down to something more modest. Her father, Edmund Vale, had died 2 years before the wedding, leaving an estate that was mostly composed of properties encumbered by debt, a few surviving investments, and a name that still meant something in certain philanthropic circles. Serafina had been the only child. She had maintained the name with dignity, which was worth something. She had handled the estate settlement with competence, which impressed him. She was beautiful, which was not irrelevant, and she had married him without negotiating, which he had interpreted as either love or exhaustion, and had never felt the need to determine which. She had been a good wife by the standard he applied to the role. She managed the household with precision. She appeared when she needed to appear. She dressed well. She was cordial to the people he needed her to be cordial to. She never embarrassed him publicly, and she never asked questions she wasn't supposed to ask. What she did not do was interest him particularly, and what she did not do was challenge him, which he would have found irritating had she tried, and which he had instead absorbed as simply a feature of her character, a certain passivity, a certain contentment with the circumscribed world he had essentially constructed around her. This was, it turned out, one of the most catastrophic misreadings of his life. But not yet. "Dinner's 20 minutes, she said, without turning. He loosened his tie and sat at the kitchen island, picked up the newspaper she had folded and left there, which was the kind of small, habitual consideration she performed without remark. "How was your lunch?" he said. "Good. The Arts Council is planning a new youth program. They want to expand into 3 new boroughs." "With whose money?" "Donations. They're building a campaign, spending money on campaigns to raise money so they can spend more money on campaigns," he said, in the tone he used for things he found circular and faintly idiotic. "There's an industry for you." Serafina didn't respond to that. "The Gala sponsorship fell through," he said, watching her. She turned slightly, not a full turn, just enough to show she was listening. "What happened?" "Some woman with more money than sense dropped $15 million in anonymous donations, bought herself a new title on the donor wall, and knocked us out of the primary sponsorship." Serafina was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant donation," she said. "It's a power move. Anonymous doesn't mean invisible. Somebody did that specifically to place themselves above us. Above me." He paused. "I'm going to find out who." Serafina turned back to the stove. He watched the line of her shoulder, the precise movements of her hands. "Maybe it was just someone who wanted to contribute," she said. "Nobody donates $15 million to place themselves below notice," he said. "That's not how that works. That's not how any of this works." He folded the newspaper. "I find the name, I understand the move. Simple. And then what?" "Depends on who it is." They ate in the dining room 20 minutes later. Damien talked about the Meridian acquisition. Not the specifics, not the financial mechanisms. He was careful about what he said at home as a matter of habit, but the general shape of it, the strategic value. He talked because it pleased him to have an audience, and because the talking helped him think. Serafina listened. She asked, at one point, about the technology. What exactly it did, how the filtration system worked. He answered impatiently. He wasn't interested in the engineering, he was interested in the contracts. She nodded and returned to her food. After dinner, she cleared the table. He went to his study and spent 2 hours on calls. When he came out, it was past 11, and the apartment was quiet and Serafina's light was off. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he went to his own room. He did not think about her again that night. 3 days passed. The city moved around Damien's operations in its usual way. The cash flows, the meetings, the structured negotiations that happen in restaurants and private clubs, and the back rooms of businesses that existed, officially, for other purposes entirely. His network was large and its maintenance required constant attention. He was good at this. He had been good at it for 20 years, and the machinery of it was by now so deeply familiar that he ran it with something approaching automaticity, the way a surgeon moves through a procedure they have performed 1,000 times. The Meridian situation was developing. Caleb Mercer had accepted Damien's invitation to a dinner meeting at a private club downtown. Damien's acquisition team had prepared a full presentation. The offer was structured as an investment partnership that would, through mechanisms that were perfectly legal in their individual components and deeply strategic in their aggregate effect, give Damien effective control of the company within 18 months. Mercer would retain the title of CEO. He would receive significant cash. He would, in practical terms, become an employee of Damien's network. This was the model. It had worked 11 times before. On the 4th day, Petrov came through. The file arrived as an encrypted attachment on Damien's secured system at 6:40 in the morning. Damien was already up. He opened it at his desk in the study, still in the clothes he'd slept in, his first coffee cooling beside him. It was thin. 3 pages. The anonymous donation to the Luminary Foundation had been processed through a private entity called Vale Charitable Holdings. The principal of that entity was listed in the underlying corporate filings as 1S Vale, with an address corresponding to a legal services firm in Lower Manhattan. Vale. Damien read the name again. Set the coffee down. Coffee. Vale was his wife's family name, her maiden name. But Edmund Vale's estate had been settled years ago, and the financial residue of it, such as it was, had been absorbed into the household finances when they married. There was nothing called Vale Charitable Holdings in any paperwork he had ever been shown or any financial summary that had ever crossed his desk. He told himself it was coincidence, a common enough name among a certain generation of New York families. There were 3 other Vale-named entities in the city's corporate registry, Petrov noted in the file. But the note at the bottom of the 3rd page stopped him. Further inquiry into the originating bank transfer suggests the source funds came from a holding structure registered in the Cayman Islands. Entity name, Vale Horizon International. Registration date, 11 years ago. 11 years ago, Serafina had been 23 years old. They had not yet met. She had been managing her dying father's affairs, or so he had believed. Damien sat with the file for a long time. The morning light moved across his desk, and he didn't move. Then he put the file away, closed the encrypted folder, and went to take a shower. He was meeting Mercer tonight. He needed to be focused. He did not, in that moment, put the pieces together. He had seen the name Vale in a file about a donor, and he had absorbed a slight unease and then set it aside because the alternative, the actual correct interpretation of what he was looking at, was so far outside the architecture of what he believed to be true that his mind refused to build toward it. This was the first failure. There would be others. The dinner with Caleb Mercer was held at a club in the West 50s called the Aldrich, which was the kind of place that had no sign on the door and required an introduction to get a membership and served food that was very good and charged what it wanted for the privilege. Damien arrived first. He was always first. Vasily took a table in the bar area. The rest of the room was the usual collection of men who had accumulated enough money that they no longer needed to discuss it directly. Mercer arrived 8 minutes late, which Damien noted without showing. He was younger in person than in photographs, with the specific restless energy of someone whose brain moved faster than his circumstances. He was wearing a jacket over a shirt with no tie, and he had the handshake of someone who had been taught to make it firm without quite naturalizing the lesson. "Mr. Volkov," he said, "this is a hell of a room." "Sit down, Caleb." The use of first names was deliberate. Damien never asked permission for it. He established the register of familiarity and let the other person adjust to it. They ordered. Mercer talked fast about the technology. The new desalination unit they were testing in partnership with a port authority overseas, the projection curves on the municipal contracts. He was not trying to sell, Damien noticed, because he didn't entirely understand yet that he needed to. He thought this was a meeting about financing. He did not yet understand it was a meeting about transition of control. "I want to talk about the structure of what we're proposing," Damien said, when the food had arrived and Mercer had gotten through the technical portion of his monologue. "Sure. Your team sent over the term sheet. I had some questions." "I know you did. I want to walk through them directly." Damien cut his steak with the economy of motion he brought to everything physical. The equity stake in the proposal, 40% initially, is the floor, not the ceiling. What we're offering in exchange for that is not just capital, it's access. The kind of access that moves contracts from letters of intent to signed agreements in jurisdictions that don't move for people who don't have relationships. Mercer was quiet for a moment. "The technology moves those contracts," he said. "The tech is the reason they're at the table." "The technology gets you in the room," Damien said. "We get the room to say yes." He put down his fork. "I've done this before, Caleb, 11 times. 7 of those companies are now operating at scale in markets they couldn't have cracked independently. The other 4 don't exist anymore because they chose other partners." It was a statement. It was also a warning. Damien issued them in the same tone and let the listener decide what they were. Mercer looked at his plate. "I'd want to retain operational independence," he said. "You'd retain the title and the lab. The business decisions run through a joint committee." "That's not independence." "No," Damien agreed. "It's partnership. Independence is for people with enough runway to reach the destination without fuel." He picked up his fork. "You're 14 months from running out of runway, Caleb. I've seen your burn rate. I know your investor situation. I'm not saying this to pressure you. I'm saying it so we can have a direct conversation." Mercer was quiet for a longer moment. "I need to think about it," he said. "Take the week," Damien said. "I'm a patient man when patience is appropriate." They finished dinner with lighter conversation. Damien asked about the engineering team, about Mercer's background, about the original idea behind the filtration patent. He was good at this, at the performance of genuine interest. By the time they shook hands in the lobby, Mercer looked more settled than he had at the beginning of the meal. Uncertain, still, but not frightened. Damien preferred it that way. Frightened men made rushed decisions. Men who were uncertain but not frightened took a week to think and then came back. He was back in the penthouse by 10:30. The lights in the main rooms were on low, and the apartment smelled faintly of the candles Serafina kept on the console in the entryway. He stood in the hall for a moment, loosening his tie, and heard her from the direction of the study. Not Damien's study, but the smaller room off the main hallway that Serafina used for what she called correspondence, which he had always taken to mean letters to her various charity contacts and thank you notes, and the kind of administrative maintenance that accompanied the social life of a woman in her position. The door was open. He passed it. She was at the desk. Not writing this time. She had a laptop open. Thin, matte black, not the household computer, and she was on a call, earbuds in. She was speaking quietly, and what she was saying in the 3 seconds before she registered him in the doorway was something about Q3 projections and an overseas position that needed to be restructured before the 15th. She looked up. The moment their eyes met, her expression shifted into something he couldn't read. Not guilt exactly, but a kind of deliberate neutrality, a closing of shutters. "Hold on one moment," she said into the earpiece. Then she took it out and looked at him. "I didn't hear you come in." "Clearly," he said. He leaned against the doorframe. What was that about? Arts Council business, the budget planning for the new program. He looked at the laptop. He looked at her. Something moved in the back of his mind. That same low unease from the morning of the file, the thing his mind had refused to build toward. The name on the file. The Cayman registration date. the call she'd just been on, and the specific vocabulary of it. Q3 projections, overseas position, which was not the vocabulary of an arts council. Arts councils don't restructure overseas positions, he said. The foundation has international donors, she said. Her voice was perfectly steady. The structuring of how their contributions flow through can get complicated. It was plausible. It was, if he hadn't been standing there in the doorway with the ghost of a file at the back of his mind, entirely plausible. And this was the quality of it. He would understand much later the quality of what she had built. It was never implausible. Every explanation fit, every surface held. He had never thought to push on it because he had never believed there was anything beneath it. Fine, he said. He went to bed. He did not sleep well. The morning before things broke open, he was in the office when Vasily came in and put another document on his desk. Meridian Water Technologies, Vasily said. His voice was its usual flat register, but his jaw was tight. There's a development. Damien looked at the document. It was a public filing notice from a Delaware holding company called Horizon Ventures, LLC, notifying of a completed acquisition of Meridian Water Technologies through a purchase of the founding equity stake and both venture tranches. When did this file? Damien said. This morning. The transaction closed yesterday. Caleb Mercer sold. Yes. To Horizon Ventures. Yes. Damien set the document down. He knew how to be still when he needed to be still. Who is Horizon Ventures? The parent company is Vail Horizon Group, registered in Delaware. Principal offices listed in New York and Geneva. Vasily paused. I ran it further back. Vail Horizon Group is a multi-billion-dollar investment holding company. Private. It is operated below media profile through a structure of subsidiaries and offshore holdings. Another pause. The company is 11 years old. 11 years. Damien looked at the document for a long time. The luminary donation? He said. Vail Charitable Holdings is a subsidiary of Vail Horizon Group. Yes. The office was very quiet. And the principal of Vail Horizon Group, Damien said. Vasily set a second document on top of the first, a corporate registration filing. The principal was listed as Serafina Vail, not Serafina Volkov. Serafina Vail, a legal name she had maintained through instruments Damien had never seen, in parallel with the married name she wore in public. Damien sat in the chair that had held him through 20 years of decisions and felt, for the first time he could remember, the specific unsteadiness of a man who has been standing on a floor he believed was solid and has just felt it move. His wife. His quiet, errand-running, arts council lunch, black Valentino-wearing wife, had just bought the company he had spent 8 months building toward, had been operating a multi-billion-dollar empire for 11 years, had donated $15 million to erase his name from the top of a donor wall, and had done all of it from inside his own home, without him ever once. He stood up. The chair rolled back and hit the credenza behind him, and he didn't register the sound. Get me home, he said. She was there when he arrived. Of course she was. She was sitting in the living room with a book open in her lap and a cup of tea on the table beside her, dressed in the kind of afternoon simplicity that had always seemed to him like the natural state of a woman with nothing particular to do. The gray-green eyes came up when he walked in. She looked at his face. Something moved in her expression briefly. Not surprise, recognition. You know, she said, who are you? Came out rougher than he intended. He was in the center of the room now, the document still in his hand, and his hand was not entirely steady. I'm your wife. Don't. He stopped, controlled the temperature of it. Vail Horizon Group, Meridian Water Technologies, the luminary donation. 11 years, Serafina. She set the book down, folded her hands in her lap with the particular composure that he had always taken for placidity, and now, with the floor still moving under him, understood as something else entirely, something trained, something deliberate, something that had been watching him from a very short distance for 5 years and keeping its own counsel. You were going to take Caleb's company, she said. Not an accusation, a statement of fact. That was a deal I had been working for 8 months. I know. You knew. He heard his own voice as if from a distance. You knew about the Meridian acquisition. I knew about it for 6 months, she said. I was watching it. The room was very still. Why? He looked at her across the coffee table, and the distance felt enormous and also very small. Why would you do this? Why the... He stopped again. There was so much behind the question that it wouldn't fit through the door of a single sentence. All of it. The company, the Gala donation, all of it. Why? Serafina looked at him for a long moment. Because I could, she said, and then quieter. And because I was tired of pretending I couldn't. He looked at his wife. His wife looked back at him. And in the silence between them, something that had been slow and invisible for years shifted into a shape that both of them could now see clearly, though neither of them yet knew what it meant, or how it would end, or how far it was going to fall before it reached the bottom. The silence stretched between them like something physical, like a wire pulled to the edge of its tolerance, and Damien stood in the center of his own living room with the corporate filing in his hand and felt the particular vertigo of a man whose map has just been revealed as fiction. He set the document on the coffee table. Slowly. The deliberateness of it was the only thing he trusted himself to control right now. 11 years, he said. Yes. You built a multi-billion-dollar investment holding company. In 11 years, while... He stopped. While what? While living in his apartment. While attending his dinners. While wearing the dresses he selected and standing at his side at the events that mattered to him and running her small, inconsequential errands. Where? What do you mean, where? Where did you build it? When? You're here, Serafina. You've been here every morning and every evening for 5 years, and before that you were managing your father's... My father's estate was not what you were told it was, she said. He looked at her. Explain that. She reached for her tea, took a sip. The composure of it was extraordinary, and it made his jaw tighten because it was not the composure of someone bracing for an impact. It was the composure of someone who had already moved through the impact in their mind long ago and was now simply present for the practical event of it. My father spent the last decade of his life building something, she said. He was not good at the public side of business. He was not good at visibility. What he was good at was structure, at finding undervalued assets and knowing what they could become with the right patient attention. She set the cup down. When he died, the estate looked the way it looked because he had moved everything worth keeping into structures that didn't carry the Vale name on their surface. The debts were real. The properties were real. What wasn't visible were the offshore foundations, the holding companies, the investment vehicles that he'd spent 20 years quietly assembling. He left you all of that. He left me the knowledge of where it was. The access, the infrastructure. A pause. And the instinct for it, I think. Though that part wasn't a gift so much as just what I turned out to be. Damien walked to the window. The city was below them, indifferent and enormous, and he looked at it without seeing it. You never told me, he said. No. You married me knowing. Yes. He turned. Why? The question carried more weight than the single syllable should have been able to hold. If you had all of that, if you were already operating at that scale, why marry me at all? Why the... He gestured at the apartment, the life, the entire constructed surface of what they had. Why this? Serafina was quiet for a moment, and he watched her, really watched her the way he had failed to watch her for 5 years. And what he saw in her face was not a woman calculating a response. It was a woman deciding how much truth the room could hold. Because my father warned me, she said. He told me that a woman operating at the scale I intended to operate at would need cover. That the world I was moving in, the financial world, the acquisition world, the world where the real decisions get made, was not yet arranged for a woman who showed up as herself. Not at 23. Not in the circles I needed access to. She looked at him directly. He told me to find someone powerful enough that his name would function as a shield. Someone whose public profile would absorb the attention that might otherwise fall on mine. The room was very quiet. You used me, Damien said. I married you, she said. It was a transaction on both sides. Don't pretend you married me for reasons that had nothing to do with what I represented. He had no answer for that. Because she was right, and they both knew she was right. And the particular discomfort of it was that he had never had to face it before because he had always held the advantage in this room. in this marriage, in every calculation that had ever been made between them. The fact of her greater financial power did not, he told himself, change the fundamental structure. The fact of her deception did. The Meridian acquisition, he said, that wasn't cover. That was a direct move against me. It was an acquisition of a company I had identified independently 9 months before your team identified it. You knew I was pursuing it. Yes. And you moved anyway. Yes. His voice went very quiet. This was the register people who worked with him had learned to fear more than the raised one. That was a statement. It was a business decision. Don't! He took a step toward her. Don't manage me with language right now. We're past that. You watched me spend 8 months building toward that acquisition. You knew what it meant to my network's expansion, and you went around me and took it. That is not a business decision in isolation. That is a message. Serafina looked at him steadily. You want to talk about messages, she said. All right. 3 weeks ago, you told me in this room that everything I had came from your name. Those were your exact words. Everything you have comes from my name. Do you remember saying that? He remembered. That was a different conversation. It was a Tuesday. We had just finished dinner. I had mentioned the Arts Council program, and you looked at me the way you look at things you find decorative but not serious, and you said, her voice didn't shake. That was the thing. It didn't shake at all. You said, let me be clear about something. Without the Volkov name behind you, you'd be running bake sales for a foundation nobody's heard of. Everything you have access to, every room you walk into, every person who takes your call, that comes from me. He looked at the floor for a moment. I was angry about something else. You were angry about the Hargrove deal falling through, and you came home and I was there, and that is what you said to me. Her voice remained level. It wasn't the first time. It's never the first time with you. There is always something else that you are angry about, and I am always available. You want to do this now? Go through a catalog of... No, she said. I don't. What I want is for you to understand that the Meridian acquisition was not the opening move, Damien. It was a response. You've been making moves for 5 years. I've been absorbing them. I decided to stop absorbing. He stood in the room and breathed and felt the anger. And underneath the anger, something worse. Something he didn't have a ready name for. A kind of hollow recognition. The feeling of counting back through years of moments and understanding for the first time what was happening in them. So what is this, he said. What is the play here? You expose yourself, you burn 5 years of cover, for what? To teach me a lesson. I'm not teaching you anything. I'm done managing what you know and don't know. I'm tired of it. You're tired, he repeated. The edge in it was sharp. Yes, she said simply. I am. He picked up the corporate filing from the coffee table, held it. The Gala, he said. You're the anonymous donor. Yes. You're going to be there. I'm the founding patron. Yes. He thought about what that meant. The room full of the people he needed, the people who constituted the actual social and financial infrastructure of the city's power structure, all of them watching. He thought about the moment the name was announced. He thought about his own face in that room when it happened. This is humiliation, he said. This is a public acknowledgement of work I've done, she said. Whether you experience it as humiliation is your own geometry. He set the document back down, very carefully. We're not done with this conversation, he said. I know, she said. He went to his study and closed the door. He did not sleep, not in any real sense. He lay in the dark and moved through it, through the 11 years, the structure of it, the patient invisible construction of an empire that had been growing inside his own household, inside the scaffolding of his name, while he was busy believing he was the only thing in the room worth looking at. The humiliation of it was not simple. It was layered. There was the professional dimension, the fact of the Meridian acquisition, the Gala donation, the evidence of a financial operation that dwarfed his own legitimate holdings. Then there was the personal dimension, which was harder to look at directly. The question of what he had been, in her calculation. A shield, she had said. A name functioning as cover. He had told himself for 5 years that he tolerated the marriage because it served him. Now he understood she had been operating from the same logic, with more precision and greater returns. At 3 a.m, he got up and went to his study and spent 2 hours pulling at threads. His financial analyst, his corporate intelligence contacts. He had access to resources that could map a company's structure in 72 hours. He had done it to competitors, to partners, to men he needed to understand before he dealt with them. He had never done it to his wife because it had never occurred to him that his wife was a category of entity that required that kind of scrutiny. What he found, in the preliminary picture that assembled itself in the early morning hours, was worse than he had expected. Vale Horizon Group was not a large private investment firm. It was massive. The holdings, mapped through their offshore structures, touched industries across 4 continents: technology, infrastructure, pharmaceutical supply chains, clean energy. The total asset base, in rough estimation, ran north of $40 billion. $40 billion. He sat with that number. His own network, legitimate and otherwise combined, was valued at approximately $4 billion by the most generous reckoning. His wife was 10 times his size, had been for years, had sat across from him at the dinner table for 5 years while he explained to her, in the patient tone he used for people who needed things simplified, how business worked. Dan. Morning came without him noticing the transition. His phone started at 7 with the usual sequence of messages, and he responded to them mechanically. Vasily arrived at 9 for the daily briefing and found Damien behind his desk in yesterday's shirt, the desk covered in printed documents, looking like a man who had spent the night at war with information. Vasily was too experienced to comment on the visual. He sat down, opened his folder, and proceeded. "Meridian is done," he said. "Horizon Ventures closed at full value. Mercer signed everything yesterday morning." "I know. You want to pursue action, breach of negotiation, interference with—" "There was no binding agreement," Damien said. "We had a dinner. You can't sue a man for selling to someone else when you haven't put paper in front of him." "We could make it difficult for Mercer. Personally, leave Mercer alone." The instruction came out flat. He took a better deal. That's his right. Vasily was quiet for a moment, which was its own kind of comment. "The Luminary Gala Host Committee," Vasily said, moving on. "Fredericks came through. You're on the host committee. Your name is in the program. Below the founding patron." "Yes. And the founding patron's name will be announced at the event. Standard for that level of donation. The foundation will make a presentation, name, remarks, the whole ceremony." Damien was quiet. "Who else knows," he said, "about Vale Horizon?" "On my end, just me and Petrov. Keep it that way." "And the situation with Mrs. Volkov?" Damien looked up at him for the first time since he'd walked in. "What situation?" he said. Vasily met his eyes and held them for a moment. He was 60 years old next spring, and he had been watching Damien Volkov operate for 16 of them. He knew when to press and when to let a door close. "Understood," he said, and moved to the next item. They circled each other for 4 days. That was the only way to describe it. The apartment was large enough that coexistence without contact was architecturally possible, and they used the architecture. Serafina maintained her routines with a consistency that, in other circumstances, might have looked like nothing had changed. She was up early. She had her coffee. She disappeared into the correspondence room for hours at a time with the matte black laptop and the earpiece. She cooked dinner 3 of the 4 nights. She appeared at the doorway of his study once to tell him that the dry cleaning had been picked up and that the Hargroves had sent an invitation to their daughter's engagement party. Did he want to respond? He looked at her. "Do we need to go?" he said. "It would be polite." "Fine. Send the card. We'll go." She nodded. She left. He stared at the doorway she had left through for a long time. On the 3rd night, she was on a call that ran past midnight. He heard her through the study door as he passed to the kitchen. Her voice was low, quick, fluent in the specific language of international finance. She was talking about a position in a Southeast Asian infrastructure fund, the timing of a quarterly disbursement, the legal review of a cross-border acquisition in a market he had, until this moment, no idea she was operating in. He stood in the hallway with a glass of water and listened for perhaps 90 seconds, long enough to understand that she was not managing a philanthropic budget, long enough to understand that whoever was on the other end of that call was not a volunteer coordinator. He went to bed. On the fourth evening, he came home to find her at the kitchen island again with the notebook open, the pen moving. He hung up his jacket. He poured water. He stood across from her and watched her write for a moment without speaking. "You acquired Meridian," he said. "What's next?" She looked up. "That's my business." "We are still married." "Yes," she said. "We are." "Then what's next? You're not doing this to run a water technology company. You have $40 billion in assets. Meridian is a rounding error. So what's the move? The gala is in 3 weeks, and your name is going on the wall of that building, and everyone in that room is going to know who you are. Your cover is done. So what is this the beginning of?" She looked at him for a long moment. He had the feeling, not for the first time, and now with full understanding of what it meant, that she was somewhere 2 moves ahead of him and deciding how much of the board to let him see. "It's the beginning of not hiding," she said. "And what happens to this?" he said. A gesture encompassing the apartment, the life, the structural arrangement that had, it now turned out, been built on a misunderstanding of who held the actual weight. "I don't know yet," she said, which was, he understood, a lie. Or not precisely a lie, a withheld truth. She knew. She had planned for whatever came next. She had planned for everything. The not knowing she offered him was a courtesy, and the fact that it was a courtesy, that she was managing the delivery of truth to him in measured doses for reasons that may or may not have included a residue of regard, was itself a kind of information about where they stood. He nodded. He went to his study. He did not come out for dinner. On the 5th day, everything cracked. It began with a call from Marcus Hale, who ran the legitimate real estate arm of Damien's network through a series of LLCs and who had been, for 12 years, one of the 3 people Damien trusted most in his operational structure. Marcus called at 11 in the morning and was brief in the way people are brief when they don't want to say the thing over the phone. They met at a coffee shop in the East 50s. Marcus was 60, heavy through the shoulders, and had a face that looked like it had absorbed a great deal of information over a long life without showing much of it. He put a folder on the table between them. "This came to my attention this morning," Marcus said, "through Delgado, who handles the debt instruments on the Meridian Holdings portfolio." Damien opened the folder. It was a debt assignment notice, a legal document indicating the transfer of a specific debt instrument, a senior secured note attached to one of Damien's legitimate holding companies, from its original issuing bank to a new creditor. The new creditor was listed as a subsidiary of Vail Horizon Group. Damien read the document 3 times. "Read. This is one note," Marcus said carefully, but Delgado flagged it because the transfer was structured in a way that suggested it was not isolated. He ran a search on the secondary debt market for instruments attached to Volkov Capital Group entities. Marcus paused. "There are 11 similar assignments that have occurred over the last 18 months. Different instruments, different entities, all transferring to Vail Horizon's subsidiaries." 11 assignments. Damien looked up from the folder. "How much exposure?" he said. "Combined? Approximately $240 million in senior secured debt across 6 legitimate holding entities." Marcus's voice was flat and careful. "If she called those notes—" "She won't call the notes," Damien said. His voice was steady through an act of will. "You know that." "She's my wife." Marcus looked at him with the specific expression of a man who has known him for 12 years and has just been given information that reorganizes everything he thought he understood about a situation. "Damien," he said. "I know," Damien said. "Do you?" He closed the folder, picked it up, stood. "I'll handle it," he said. He went home. The car moved through midday traffic, and he sat in the back with the folder on the seat beside him and felt the full shape of it, finally, without the partial obstructions of the last 5 days. She had not just acquired Meridian. She had not just outbid him at the gala. For 18 months, while he was having dinners, while he was sleeping in the next room, while he was instructing her on what dress to wear, she had been quietly, methodically, purchasing the debt that financed the visible, legitimate surface of his empire. Through subsidiary structures that carried no visible connection to her name. Through the secondary market, in instruments small enough individually that none of his financial monitors had flagged the pattern. She had become his largest creditor, and she had done it while living in his house. He walked into the penthouse, and she was there, in the living room, standing at the window in the afternoon light, her phone in her hand, and she turned when he came in. He held up the folder. Her expression remained still for a moment. Then something shifted in it, something he had never seen on her face before. Not guilt, not fear, but a kind of bracing, the way a person looks when they have been waiting for something and it has finally arrived. And despite having prepared for it, the arrival is still, at its core, a collision. "Sit down," he said. "Damien, sit down, Serafina." She sat. Not quickly, not with the submission of someone reacting to a command, but with the deliberate slowness of someone choosing to comply because compliance suits their purposes. He registered the distinction, and it made the thing in his chest tighter. He put the folder on the coffee table between them, the same table where he'd put the first document 5 days ago. The table had become a kind of altar for revelations. 240 million, he said. 6 holding entities, 18 months. She looked at the folder, then at him. "Yes," she said. "You bought my debt. I acquired debt instruments that were available on the secondary market, legally, through structures that—" "Stop." His voice was very quiet. "Don't give me the legal framework. You bought my debt. You have been, for 18 months, positioning yourself as the creditor on the legitimate financial infrastructure of my network, while sleeping in my house." She didn't answer that. "Look at me," he said. She looked at him. "Was any of it real?" he said. The question cost him something to ask. He could feel it, the cost of it, in the way his voice almost didn't hold the last word level. "Any of it, the 5 years. Any of it." Something moved across her face. Not the calculated neutrality, something older and less managed. "Some of it," she said. "Which part?" She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know how to answer that in a way that's both honest and kind," she said. "Don't be kind," he said. "Be honest." She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. "I respected you," she said. "In the beginning, the way you moved, the way you built things, the way you walked into a room and understood the geometry of it in 30 seconds. I respected that genuinely. I thought—" She stopped. "I thought we might be more alike than you knew, that eventually you would see it, that you would be curious about who I actually was. And instead you decided what I was. On day 1 you decided, and every piece of evidence that didn't fit the picture you decided on, you just set aside. You never asked. Not once in 5 years did you sit down and ask me what I was actually thinking about, what I wanted, what I was working on." Her voice was still level, but there was something underneath it now, something that had been compressed for a long time. "You talked at me, Damien, for 5 years. You talked at me about your deals and your network and your strategy, and you performed your expertise for me like I was an audience, not a person. And whenever I tried—" "You never tried," he said. "I tried 100 times," she said. "You didn't notice, because you weren't watching." The silence that followed that was different from the earlier silences. It had texture. He stood in it and felt the truth of it moving through him in a way he didn't want to feel and couldn't stop. "The debt," he said finally, returning to the solid ground of the specific. "What are you going to do with it?" "Nothing," she said. "Right now." "Right now. I'm not going to call the notes, if that's what you're asking. I have no interest in destroying your network." "Then why buy it?" She met his eyes. "Because I needed to know that I could," she said. "Because I needed something that was real, that couldn't be taken back by a bad mood or a dismissal or a Tuesday night when you felt like reminding me of my place." Her voice dropped slightly. "The debt is insurance, Damien. It was never meant to be a weapon. It was meant to be ground to stand on. Something that was mine and real and not dependent on what you decided to think of me on any given morning." He looked at her for a long time. "The gala is in 12 days, he said. "Yes." "Your name goes on that wall." "Yes." "And everything changes." She didn't answer, which was its own answer. He picked up the folder. He walked to his study. He closed the door. He sat behind the desk and put his hands flat on the surface and breathed. Outside, the city went on at its enormous and different scale, and somewhere inside the architecture of the life he had built and believed he understood, a clock he had not known was running reached a number he had not prepared for, and the sound of it filled the room around him like awe. He didn't come out of the study that night. At some point past 2 in the morning, he heard her footsteps in the hall. They paused outside his door. He watched the sliver of light at the bottom of the door and waited. The footsteps did not continue to the master bedroom. They remained outside his door for perhaps 30 seconds. Then they moved away. He sat in the dark for another hour. Then he poured 2 fingers of whiskey from the bottle in the desk drawer, drank half of it, and began making calls. The next morning arrived gray and cold, a front moving in off the water that pressed the city flat under a low ceiling of cloud. Damien was in the office by 7. He had slept perhaps 90 minutes on the study couch, showered in the executive bathroom on the 38th floor, and was dressed and behind his desk with his second coffee before Vasily arrived. He had made 4 calls in the night. To his primary attorney, a sharp and unscrupulous woman named Carlotta Reeves, who had been navigating the legal perimeter of his operations for 14 years. To a forensic financial analyst named Gareth, who worked for no firm and several people, and who owed Damien a significant favor. To Marcus Hale, brief and specific. And to a contact in the Cayman Islands, who had, on 3 previous occasions, helped him understand the structure of entities operating in that jurisdiction. By morning, he had a clearer map. Vail Horizon Group was larger than his initial assessment. The 40 billion figure was conservative. The full asset picture, inclusive of all subsidiary holdings and offshore positions, was closer to 60. The company operated through a structure of such elegant complexity that even Gareth, who had spent his professional life unwinding corporate labyrinths, told him over the phone at 1:15 in the morning that whoever had designed the architecture was operating at a level he had rarely encountered. "It's not just big," Gareth said. "It's smart. The subsidiary layer is designed to look like unrelated entities. The offshore holdings are distributed across 4 jurisdictions in a pattern that prevents any single regulatory authority from seeing the full picture. Whoever is running the legal structure is elite level." How long has this been operating at this scale? Full build-out looks like 6 or 7 years, but the foundation structures go back 11. Whoever started this was thinking about the endgame from day 1. Damien had put down the phone and stared at the ceiling. His wife had been thinking about the endgame from day 1. Now, in the gray morning of the office, he pulled the map together and looked at it clearly. The debt instruments were the most immediately actionable lever she held over him. 240 million in called notes would not destroy him. His network's liquidity could absorb it painfully over time, but it would expose the legitimate holding structure to the kind of scrutiny that the underlying network could not withstand. The legitimate surface was, by design, supposed to look clean. Forced debt resolution, public filings, the legal proceedings that followed, called notes. These were lights pointed at surfaces that needed to stay in shadow. She knew that. Of course she knew that. She had been living inside his household. She understood exactly how much light the structure could absorb before the wrong people started asking the right questions. The question was whether she intended to use it. She had said no. Right now. He did not trust right now. Vasily came in at 9 with the daily briefing and an expression that indicated he had developed further information overnight. "The Luminary Foundation released a preliminary event program," Vasily said, putting a printed document on the desk. "Standard media distribution for a gala of this scale. Donor list, host committee, event structure." Damien looked at the program. His name was on the host committee, 3rd from the bottom. Serafina Vale's name was at the top of the donor recognition section, above the event title. There was a photograph. She was in a gray suit, direct camera, no smile, but an expression of such composed authority that she looked like someone who had been photographed by serious people for serious reasons her entire life. He did not recognize her. That was the thing. He looked at the photograph and could not locate the woman he had been married to for 5 years inside it. The woman in the photograph had nothing decorative about her. There was no softness arranged for display. She looked like what she was. Someone who ran $60 billion of assets across 4 continents and had decided to stop pretending otherwise. "Who has seen this?" he said. "It's been distributed to the Foundation's media contacts. It'll be in the financial press by this afternoon. My name is going to be on the same page as hers." "Yes." He looked at the program for another moment. Then he put it face down on the desk. "What do people think?" he said. "In our circles. is their talk. Starting, the acquisition of Meridian by a Vail Horizon subsidiary was noted in tech finance media yesterday. People are connecting it to the Gala donation. There's curiosity about who Vail Horizon is and why they've gone public now. Do they connect her to me? Not yet. The name is Vail, not Volkov, and she's been invisible long enough that the connection isn't obvious to anyone who doesn't know the personal situation. Vasile paused. That changes at the Gala.
Yes, Damien said. It has price charges. Dons.
He spent the morning thinking about the Gala, not as a social event, not as the original object of his ambition, but as a battlefield, because that was what it had become. In 12 days, his wife was going to walk into the most important room in the city's financial and political calendar and announce herself as one of the most powerful people in the world. Every significant player in that room was going to be present for the moment. And Damien Volkov, the man who had believed for 5 years that the most significant thing about his marriage was that it looked good in photographs, was going to be in the same room on the host committee watching it happen. There was no version of that evening he could control. He had been removed comprehensively and in advance from every position of leverage in the situation. He recognized the craft of it. That was the thing he could not stop circling back to even now. The craft of what she had done was extraordinary. Not the resources. Resources were a fact of scale, and scale could be built by anyone with the right combination of intelligence and patience and a father who had spent 20 years quietly assembling infrastructure. No, the craft was in the sequencing. The debt acquisition spread across 18 months in instruments small enough to avoid pattern recognition. The Meridian acquisition timed to land immediately after the Gala donation, establishing her in the business media as a major player right before the public announcement. The cover of the marriage maintained for exactly as long as it needed to be and released at the precise moment that maximized her position and minimized his. He was a man who understood strategy. He was looking at strategy that was better than his. At 2 p.m, Carlotta Reeves came to the office. She was 60, thin, with the kind of face that had never been particularly warm and had been sharpened by decades of operating in rooms where warmth was a liability. She had reviewed the debt instrument assignments overnight and sat across from Damien with her reading glasses pushed up on her head and a legal pad covered in her dense, cramped handwriting. "The assignments are clean," she said. "Every instrument was acquired through legitimate channels, secondary market, all properly documented. There's no actionable legal avenue on the acquisition itself." I didn't expect there to be. The question is what rights the new creditor holds. In the case of senior secured notes, the creditor has the right to call the notes under specific default conditions. Standard terms. She looked at her pad. None of your holding entities are currently in default. As long as you remain current on your obligations, she cannot call the notes without triggering a breach of contract on her side. So she can't move on them, not without cause. Not yet. Carlotta paused. However, the note terms for 3 of the 6 instruments include a material adverse change clause. If the financial condition of the holding entity deteriorates significantly, by the definition in each specific contract, the creditor can declare a technical default and accelerate repayment. How significant is significant? Each contract defines it differently. The tightest definition, on the Clearwater Holdings note, specifies a 20% reduction in asset value over a rolling 12-month period. Damien was quiet. "Clearwater," he said. "Yes." Carlotta looked at him. "I understand Clearwater has had some exposure issues in the last quarter." Clearwater Holdings was the legitimate real estate arm, the one Marcus ran. It had taken losses on 2 commercial properties in the last year as the market shifted, losses that were manageable in isolation, but that had, together, moved the asset value in a direction Damien had been monitoring with moderate concern. "How close are we to the 20% trigger?" he said. 14% current reduction. You have margin." She paused. "But not enormous margin, and if the commercial property market continues the current trajectory over the next 2 quarters, I understand the math." She nodded. "There's one more thing," she said. She turned a page on the legal pad. "I ran a broader search on Vail Horizon's subsidiary activity touching your network. The debt instruments are the largest exposure, but there are smaller positions." She looked at the page. 3 of your technology vendor relationships, companies that provide infrastructure services to your legitimate operations, were acquired by Veil Horizon subsidiaries within the last 14 months. Damien went very still. Which vendors? She told him the names. He knew them. All 3 were operational necessities, specialized technology and security infrastructure that would take 6 to 8 months to replace if the vendor relationships were terminated. She controls the vendors, he said. The subsidiaries control the vendors. There's no formal connection to Mrs. Volkov visible in the corporate structure. She controls the vendors, he said again. The room was quiet. He understood now the full picture, the complete architecture, and it was so much larger than what he had seen that the seeing of it produced in him something he had not felt since he was very young and very new to the world he had since mastered. He felt afraid, not the sharp tactical fear of an immediate threat, which was a thing he knew how to manage. This was something slower and colder, the fear of a man who looks at the board and understands, for the first time, that he has been playing a different game than the one his opponent has been playing, and that his opponent has already won 3 moves of the game he didn't know he was in. She controlled his debt. She controlled 3 of his critical operational vendors. She had acquired the company he had spent 8 months building toward. She had outmaneuvered him at the single most important social event of his year. And she had done all of it from inside his house, from the correspondence room down the hall, from the kitchen island with her notebook, from the small earpiece and the matte black laptop, from 5 years of quiet that he had read as passivity and which had been the entire time. He went home at 6. The apartment was quiet when he came in. The candle on the console table was lit. The kitchen was empty. He stood in the hallway and listened and heard nothing. He went to the correspondence room. The door was open, the desk was clear, the laptop was gone. He went to the master bedroom. Her closet was open. He stood in the doorway and looked. Her clothes were there. Her shoes. The personal effects on the bathroom counter were there. She hadn't left. He found her on the terrace. 53 floors up, the city spread below them like a circuit board with the current running, and she was standing at the railing with a glass of red wine, her hair loose, her back to him. She was wearing the dark coat she wore when the weather turned, and she looked from the doorway like herself, like the woman he had looked at for 5 years without seeing. He opened the terrace door. The cold air hit him. She turned. He looked at her face and saw something he had not seen in any of the conversations of the last 5 days. She looked tired. Genuinely tired, not the managed surface of their negotiations, but something underneath it, something human and depleted. And for a moment, the specificity of it cut through the tactical thinking and hit him somewhere else entirely. Carlotta went through the vendor acquisitions today, he said. Serafina looked at him. She took a sip of wine. I know you were at the meeting, she said. The vendors, Serafina. His voice came out rougher than he intended. That's not insurance. That's leverage, she said. Yes. You're holding leverage over operations that... He stopped, because what he was about to say was that those operations included things that the wrong kind of scrutiny could not withstand. And he did not say that on terraces 53 floors above the city, not even to his wife. Especially not to his wife. You know what those vendor relationships touch, he said instead. I do, she said. I've known for 4 years what they touch. He was quiet for a moment. What do you want, he said. Just say it directly. What is this building toward? What do you want? She looked at the city for a moment. Then she turned to face him fully, and whatever residual tiredness was in her expression organized itself into something clear and final. I want my name back, she said. My real name on my real work. I want to walk into that gala in 12 days as Serafina Veil and not have to manage what that means for you. I want to run my company in public, the way I've been running it in private, without this... She gestured between them with the wine glass, a small, precise gesture that encompassed the entire architecture of the last 5 years. Without this performance. And the marriage. She looked at him. I think you know the answer to that, she said. He stood at the terrace door. The cold came off the city in waves. He looked at this woman he had been married to for 5 years and had never known, and he felt the ground shifting under him again, the ground that had been shifting for days now, that showed no sign of stabilizing. and understood with a clarity that was almost physical that the thing he had believed he owned had never been his, had been borrowed from the beginning, and was being returned to its actual owner now with the calm finality of someone closing a transaction that had served its purpose and run its course. He turned and went back inside. He picked up his phone, called Vasily. "The Gala," he said. "I need everything we have on every attendee. Financial positions, current vulnerabilities, who they need, who they owe. I want it by end of week." "What's the play?" Vasily said. "I don't know yet," Damien said. "I need the room before I decide." He put the phone down. He stood in the living room of the penthouse that bore his name on the deed and his address on the mailbox and contained, somewhere inside its 53 floors of silence, a woman who had been running a $60 billion empire from its correspondence room for 5 years, and he understood with the cold and perfect clarity of a man who has just lost the game he thought he was winning that the Gala was not a social event anymore. It was the only battlefield left, and he had 11 days to figure out how to fight on it. He was still thinking about what that meant, still assembling the shape of whatever came next, when his phone buzzed on the table beside him. A message from Petrov. Short. No preamble. Found something. Not the debt, not the vendors. Something older. You need to see this tonight. Damien looked at the message. Then he picked up his coat and walked out. The car was downstairs in 4 minutes. He was in the back seat, heading toward Petrov's location before the building's lobby doors had finished closing behind him. The city moved past the windows in its nighttime arrangement of light and shadow, and he sat with his phone in his hand and did not look at it, looking instead at the street, at the people on the sidewalks, at the normal machinery of the world that continued operating regardless of what was happening inside his chest. Petrov worked out of a narrow office above a printing business in the West 20s that smelled of ink and old carpet and contained, inside its modest dimensions, more computing infrastructure than most small intelligence operations. He was 55, slight, with close-cropped gray hair, and the specific stillness of a man who spent most of his professional life looking at information that other people had tried to hide. He had worked with Damien for 9 years. He was not prone to drama. The fact that the message had said tonight was its own kind of alarm. Damien took the stairs. Petrov was at his primary workstation when Damien came through the door, and he looked up with an expression that Damien catalogued in the first half-second. Not fear, not excitement, but the particular gravity of a man sitting with information that has changed the shape of something. "Close the door," Petrov said. Damien closed it. "Sit down." "Tell me." Petrov turned the monitor toward him. It was a document, old, by the look of the scan quality. The paper had yellowed at the edges. The typeface was the kind that preceded digital formatting, a corporate registration filing from a Cayman Islands administrative office, dated 17 years ago. The entity name was Vale Horizon International. Damien had seen this before. The founding date of Serafina's empire. He had been told it was 11 years old. Petrov had told him 11 years. The original file. "Look at the signatory," Petrov said. Damien looked at the signatory line. The name was not Serafina Vale. The name was Edmund Vale. He looked up at Petrov. "Her father," Damien said, "founded the entity 17 years ago, not 11. The 11-year figure comes from a subsequent restructuring that changed the registered address and the operational documentation. But the original founding, the original capital contribution, the original asset transfer, that was Edmund Vale, 17 years ago, 3 years before he died." Damien looked at the document again. "The capital contribution," he said. "What was the initial amount?" Petrov tapped the keyboard and brought up a second document, an account statement from the corresponding trust period. The initial capital contribution to Vale Horizon International, made by Edmund Vale 17 years ago, was listed as $1.2 billion. Damien sat back. "The estate was broke," he said. "When she settled the estate, there was nothing. Properties with debt against them, a few residual investments. That's what the probate record showed." "The probate record showed what Edmund Vale intended it to show," Petrov said. "I went back through the filings. The estate settlement was handled through a law firm that no longer exists. The probate attorney retired 18 months after the settlement closed and relocated out of the country. The properties with debt on them, those were real. They were also, I believe, deliberate. A real surface of financial difficulty,
laid over a hidden infrastructure that had already been moved beyond the reach of any estate proceeding. He hid it. He had been hiding it for years. The $1.2 billion was itself the residue of a longer process of asset accumulation and concealment. Edmund Vale was not the man the public record described. Petrov paused. I've been pulling threads for 3 days. The picture that's coming together is substantial. Damien looked at the monitor, at the name in the signatory line. Edmund Vale. A man he had met twice, both times in the final year of his life, when he was visibly ill and apparently diminished. A man Serafina had described as a failed businessman, whose estate was mostly composed of debt and obligation. A man whose legacy Damien had, in his worst moments, used as a point of contempt. You'd be running bake sales for a foundation nobody's heard of. He thought about what she'd said on that Tuesday night when he'd said those words to her. He thought about what it had cost her to sit there and absorb them. There's more, Petrov said. Go. The original capital, the $1.2 billion. I traced the source. Petrov pulled up a third document. It came from a series of liquidations in the mid-2000s, assets that had been held in structures Edmund Vale controlled. The source of those assets predates the holding structures by another decade. He looked at Damien. Edmund Vale didn't build this. He inherited it from his own father, the Vale family. The public record of the Vale family is, I believe, a performance that has been maintained across 3 generations. The visible story, old money mismanaged into decline, a name without substance, was constructed, deliberately constructed, as cover. Damien stood up. He walked to the window. The street below was quiet, a cab moving slowly past, the printing business dark, the normal sleeping weight of a city block at night. 3 generations. Serafina hadn't built cover for herself. She had been born into cover. She had grown up inside a family that had spent 3 generations constructing a public face of diminishment and decline behind which an actual empire was quietly, invisibly compounding. She had not learned the technique from her father. She had been raised inside it. She was the 3rd iteration of a strategy that her grandfather had originated and her father had maintained, and she had inherited along with the access, the infrastructure, and as she had put it, the instinct. The instinct. Not a gift, she had said. Just what I turned out to be. He turned from the window. What does she know that I don't know yet? He said. Petrov was quiet for a moment. I think the more relevant question, he said carefully, is what she knows about you. Damien looked at him. Say it plainly. I've been running parallel research. Petrov chose his next words with the precision of a man navigating a minefield he has partially mapped. In tracing the Vale Horizon structure, I found evidence of monitoring, financial monitoring, the kind that involves access to transaction records, counterparty data, operational information that would not be publicly available. She's been monitoring my network for at least 4 years, possibly longer. The access points are sophisticated, not aggressive. She's not extracting operational data. She's not building a dossier for law enforcement, but she has been watching in detail. Damien's voice went very flat. How much detail? Petrov looked at him steadily. Enough, he said, that if she chose to share what she knows with certain parties, the consequences would be significant. The word significant sat in the room between them. Damien understood precisely what it meant. The legitimate surface of his network was the membrane that kept everything else invisible. It was the wall between the architecture of his actual operations and the attention of people whose attention he could not survive. Serafina had been watching that wall from the inside for 4 years. She knew its thickness. She knew where the cracks were. She had never used it. She had said the debt was insurance, ground to stand on. This was the same thing, elevated by several orders of magnitude. She's not going to use it, Damien said. No, Petrov agreed. I don't believe she intends to, but she has it. She has it. He sat back down. The chair felt different than it had 20 minutes ago. Everything felt different than it had 20 minutes ago. He had spent the last 11 days assembling a picture of what Serafina had built, and each new layer had been larger and more precisely constructed than the one before it. And now he was sitting with the full picture of it, the 3 generations, the monitoring, the leverage in its complete form, and understanding that the woman he had dismissed for 5 years as decorative and peripheral had been, for the entirety of their marriage, the most dangerous person in his life. Not because she wanted to destroy him, because she could, and had chosen, so far, not to. That distinction was the thing. It was the thing that kept moving through him as he sat in Petrov's ink-smelling office and tried to find the outline of a position. She had leverage that could end him. She had chosen not to use it. The choice was not weakness. He understood now with complete clarity that nothing she did was weakness. The choice was something else, something he didn't have a clean word for, standing where he was standing with the history he had between them. He thought about Tuesday nights. He thought about dinner tables and dismissals and the specific vocabulary of contempt that he had deployed, casually, regularly, as a feature of how he moved through the world. He thought about what it meant to absorb that for 5 years while sitting on the capacity to end the person delivering it. She had chosen not to. He did not know what to do with that. He was back in the penthouse by midnight. She was asleep, or appeared to be. He did not disturb the door. He sat in his study until 3 in the morning, and he did something he had not done in 20 years of operating in environments that required constant tactical thinking. He sat without a plan. He let the information sit on the desk in front of him without assembling it into moves. He let himself feel the full weight of what the last 11 days had produced, the inversion of every assumption he had made about his marriage and his position and the architecture of his life. He was not a man given to self-examination. It was not a skill he had cultivated or considered necessary. The work of the last 20 years had required the opposite, a kind of forward-directed tunnel vision, an ability to move without the friction of too much interiority. He had built his network through action and through the willingness to take and hold positions without second-guessing. He had believed this quality to be strength. Sitting in the study at 3 in the morning with Petrov's documents in front of him, he began for the first time to wonder if it was also the thing that had made him blind. The morning of the gala arrived with the particular quality of mornings that have been building toward themselves for weeks. It was a Saturday. Damien was up at 6. He went through his usual sequence: coffee, the secured tablet, the overnight summaries, but the information moved through him differently today, without the satisfaction that usually accompanied the review of his operational picture. The machine was running. It was running fine, but the machine existed inside a context that had fundamentally changed, and running the machine without acknowledging the change was a performance he was performing for no audience. At 9, he heard her moving in the apartment. The sounds were ordinary: the kitchen, the coffee, the specific sound of her notebook being set on the counter. He stayed in his study until 10, then he walked out. She was dressed for the day, but not yet for the evening. Dark slacks, a white shirt, her hair pulled back. She looked up when he came in, and something crossed her face. A wariness, a readiness, the expression of someone who has been preparing for a conversation and is not certain which version of it they're about to have. He sat down at the kitchen island. She stayed on the other side. "I know about your grandfather," he said. She was very still for a moment. "Petrov is thorough," she said. "I know about the monitoring." She put down her coffee cup. Her hands were still. They were always still. "I never used it," she said. "I know." "Then, I want to understand why." His voice was quieter than he expected it to come out. "Not tactically. I understand the tactical answer. I want to understand why you didn't." She looked at him for a long moment. He watched her, deciding how much of the real answer to give him. "Because it would have been the end," she said. "And I wasn't ready for the end. Not like that." A pause. "Not with you unable to defend yourself." He looked at his hands on the counter. "That's not nothing," he said. "No," she said. "It's not." They sat in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the windows and the city below them doing what it always did, and the silence between them was different from all the previous silences. It didn't have the tension of unspoken leverage or the cold geometry of adversarial positioning. It had something more uncomfortable in it, something that was the residue of 5 years of living in the same space with a person and understanding, very late, that you had failed to see them. "Tonight," he said. "Tonight," she agreed. "I'll be in the room when they announce you." "I know." "What do you need from me?" She looked at him. The question clearly surprised her. He watched the surprise move across her face before she managed it back into composure. "Nothing," she said. I don't need anything from you. I know you don't. He met her eyes. I'm asking anyway. She looked at him for a long time with those gray-green eyes that he had spent 5 years looking at without looking, and she said, "Just don't make it about you." It landed. He felt it land. "All right," he said. He went to get dressed. Med. The Luminary Gala was held at the Meridian Grand, a venue on the Upper East Side that had been built in the 1920s and had been restored twice since, with enough money to make it feel like a location where history had always happened and intended to continue. The ballroom ran 200 feet from end to end and held 400 people in its configuration for this evening, and every one of those 400 people was the kind of person who controlled something: a government portfolio, a capital pool, an industry, a narrative. The room was a concentrated version of the actual architecture of power, stripped of its usual geographic dispersal, assembled in one place for one evening, which was what made it the target it had always been. Damien arrived at 7:40 with Vasily in the car and entered the room knowing he had been inside it before, but feeling its weight differently tonight. He knew the faces, he knew the histories. He had the dossier on every significant player in the room, their current vulnerabilities and ambitions, and the specific geometry of what they needed that he might be able to provide. This was how he always entered a room. It was the only way he knew how. But tonight the dossier felt like a map to a territory that had been remapped. He took his position on the host committee table. He accepted a drink. He worked the room in the 40 minutes before the program began. Handshakes, the brief encrypted exchanges that happened between men who understood each other's actual business without ever naming it. The performance of authority and ease that he had mastered so long ago it had become genuine. At 8:45 he looked toward the entrance. She came in alone. The gown was sapphire blue, floor length, architectural in the way of something designed to carry a specific kind of presence across a room. Her hair was down. She wore no visible jewelry except a single piece at her throat, small and precise. She moved through the entrance and into the ballroom with the walk of a person who has decided, at a specific moment in their life, to stop managing how much space they take up. The room noticed. He watched it happen. The way attention shifted, the way heads turned and conversations flagged, and people recalibrated their understanding of who was in the room. She hadn't done anything. She had simply arrived as herself, completely, without the dampening mechanisms she had deployed for 5 years, and the effect of it was immediate and unmistakable. Damien stood at the host table and watched his wife move through the room and felt something break open in his chest that he didn't have a name for. It wasn't rage. It wasn't the cold, tactical anger he was fluent in. It was something rawer and more disorganized, something that lived in the part of him that he had spent 20 years concrete sealing over because it was incompatible with the work. He watched a senator from the finance committee cross the room to introduce himself to her. He watched the CEO of one of the 3 largest sovereign wealth funds in the world shake her hand with 2 hands, the grip of genuine respect. He watched her move through it all with the ease of a person arriving home. He finished his drink. At 9:15, the program began. The foundation's executive director made remarks. 2 board members spoke. The room was warm with the particular energy of wealthy people in a room together, the low-frequency vibration of aggregated power in a good mood. Damien sat at the host table and kept his face arranged and listened to the program move toward the moment he had known was coming, since the morning he had read the file in his study. The executive director returned to the podium. "This evening," she said, "we have the privilege of recognizing a gift to this foundation that represents the most significant single donation in our 40-year history." She paused for the weight of it. The individual behind this gift has, until tonight, chosen to remain outside the public eye. Her work, in investment, in infrastructure, in the development of technologies that address some of the most urgent challenges facing communities around the world, has been conducted with a discipline and an integrity that we find humbling. Tonight, she steps forward. The room was very quiet. "It is my honor to introduce the Luminary Foundation's first ever founding patron. Please welcome Serafina Vale, founder and chief executive of Vale Horizon Group." The lights in the room shifted, and Serafina walked onto the stage. The applause started in the front rows, where the people who already knew who she was led it, and then spread back through the room as people connected the name to the woman, to the gown, to the financial press coverage of the last 2 weeks. And within 10 seconds, The sound was full and standing and genuine in the way that genuine things are different from performed ones. Damien did not applaud. He sat at the host table and looked at her on the stage and felt the room doing what it was doing around him. The recognition, the reorientation, the sudden collective understanding that the architecture of the room had someone in it they had not fully accounted for. And he felt, moving through all of it, the specific and irreversible sensation of a man watching something he had held too loosely slip completely out of his hands. She stood at the podium. The applause settled. She spoke for 7 minutes. Her voice was clear and unhurried and carried the room without effort. She talked about her father and his belief that the most durable investments were in human infrastructure, in water, in clean technology, in the communities that systems like these served. She talked about Vail Horizons' commitment to deploying capital in service of those priorities. She talked about what it meant to do this work and to do it now, publicly, with her own name on it. She did not look at him. Not once during those 7 minutes did her eyes find the host table. When she finished, the room came to its feet again. All 400 people. The senator, the sovereign wealth fund CEO, the politicians and the financiers and the operators and the people who ran things, all of them standing for the woman in the sapphire gown who had been sitting across a dinner table from Damien Volkov for 5 years and whom precisely none of them had known existed. Damien sat. He was the only person in the room who did not stand. He sat because if he stood, it would be a performance, and because if he sat, it would be noticed, and he chose the version of this that was at least honest about what it was. A man sitting still in a room that was standing for his wife. A man in a chair at the bottom of a situation he had architected through 20 years of believing the world was arranged the way he saw it. He sat, and the room stood around him. And Serafina Vail accepted the recognition of 400 of the most powerful people in the city with the composure of a woman who had been preparing for this moment for 11 years, and had always known, with a certainty she had never needed to share with anyone, that it would eventually arrive. She stepped back from the podium. Her eyes swept the room in the natural way of a person acknowledging an audience. They found him. The contact lasted perhaps 2 seconds. He could not read what was in it from this distance. He did not look away. Then she looked elsewhere. The program moved on. Damien sat in his chair with his empty glass and the roar of the room around him, and felt the architecture of the last 5 years completing its collapse in real time. And underneath the collapse, under the tactical ruin and the personal wreckage, and the specific humiliation of being the only seated man in a standing room, something else, something he had no prepared category for, was the beginning of understanding. He sat with it through the remainder of the program, through the closing remarks and the transition to the dinner service and the movement of the room from formal attention to the looser configuration of people who had been given good food and open bars and permission to work each other. He sat with his empty glass, and he did not reach for another drink, and he did not perform the room the way he would have performed it on any other evening. He just sat. Vasily materialized at his shoulder at some point, leaned down. "You want to move?" Vasily said. Quietly. Not a question exactly. "Not yet," Damien said. Vasily straightened and stepped back. He had the quality of a man who knew when his presence was the only thing being offered, and when that was enough. Across the room, Serafina was surrounded. Not the surrounded of someone being crowded, the surrounded of someone who had become a gravitational center. The sovereign wealth fund CEO was still in her orbit. 3 others had joined. She was speaking, and the people around her were listening in the way people listen when they understand they are receiving information that has value. Her hands moved occasionally, small, precise gestures, the same hands that had moved across the notebook at the kitchen island every morning for 5 years while he poured his coffee and asked her nothing. He watched her for a long time. Then he stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked across the room. She saw him coming. He watched the moment her eyes found him moving through the crowd and the calculation that moved across her face. What is this? What does this look like? What is he going to do? He had spent 5 years not understanding that calculation. He understood it now. He stopped at the edge of her circle. The Sovereign Wealth Fund CEO, whose name was Anselm Brouwer, and who ran $140 billion in assets out of Zurich, turned and looked at him with the polite blankness of a man who does not yet know the geography of a situation. "Damien Volkov," Damien said, offering his hand. Brouwer shook it. "I know your name." Volkov Capital, among other things. He looked at Serafina. Her expression had settled into a watchful neutrality. I wanted to offer my congratulations. She held his eyes. Thank you, she said. Her voice was perfectly even. The speech was good, he said. Your father would have... He stopped. He had started the sentence without knowing where it was going, which was not something that happened to him, and the stumble of it was visible, and he let it be visible. He would have found it appropriate, he finished. The right room, the right moment. Something moved in her face, brief, deep, quickly managed. Yes, she said. He would have. Brower was watching the exchange with the alert attention of a man who senses subtext without having the context to decode it. Two of the others in the circle had the same look. I won't pull you away, Damien said. Long evening ahead. He nodded once at Brower, at the others. He looked at Serafina one more time. We'll talk later. Yes, she said. We will. He walked away. He did not know if what he had just done was right or insufficient or too late to matter. He walked back to the edge of the room and stood with his back to the wall and breathed, and the room moved around him, and for the first time in a very long time, Damien Volkov was not the most powerful person in his immediate vicinity, and was standing in that fact without trying to change it. It was one of the hardest things he had done in recent memory. It was also, he understood dimly, one of the more honest. The car ride home was silent. They were in the same vehicle for the first time in days. Vasily had read the room and dismissed himself, and it was just the two of them in the back of the black car moving through the city's late-night geometry, the lights coming through the windows in long, sweeping passes. Serafina sat with her wrap around her shoulders and her hands in her lap and looked out at the street. Damien sat on his side with 3 inches of seat between them and looked at his own hands and did not speak. The silence was not comfortable. It was not the practiced coexistence of the last 5 days. It was the silence of two people who have just been through something that has changed the shape of everything and do not yet know how to begin speaking in the new language of it. The car pulled up to the building. They rode the elevator in the same silence. 53 floors. The elevator had always felt too small, but tonight it felt enormous, as though the space between them had expanded to fill the available architecture. The penthouse was dark except for the console light. She reached to turn on the lamp in the entryway, and the room came up soft and familiar around them. The same room, the same furniture, the same 53 floors above the same city. Everything identical to every other night they had come home to it. Everything completely different. She set her clutch on the console table. She reached up and removed the piece at her throat. The single piece of jewelry, small and precise, and he now noticed a locket, thin gold, the kind of thing you kept something inside. He had never seen it before. She had been wearing it under her collar for 5 years, presumably, and he had never once noticed. She set it beside the clutch. Sit down, Damien, she said. He sat. She did not sit immediately. She moved to the kitchen, poured 2 glasses of water, came back and sat across from him on the opposite end of the couch. She put 1 glass in front of him. She held the other. She looked at him, and he looked at her. And for a moment neither of them spoke, and the city was dark beyond the windows, and the apartment held them in its familiar silence. I'm filing for dissolution next week, she said. My attorney has had the paperwork prepared for 3 months. He had known this was coming. He had known it from the moment on the terrace when she had said she wanted her name back, when he had asked about the marriage, and she had said she thought he knew the answer. Knowing a thing is coming and receiving it as a statement are 2 different experiences, and he sat with the difference. 3 months, he said. Yes. Before the gala. Before any of this. Yes. I had made the decision before I moved on Meridian. Before the donation. The public reveal was not an act of aggression toward you. It was simply the next step. My next step. After the dissolution, I can't maintain the cover any longer anyway. It becomes legally complicated. He looked at the water glass in front of him. The ice was melting in slow increments. The debt instruments, he said. I will sell them back to the issuing banks at par value within 30 days of the dissolution filing. No profit, clean exit. He looked up. Why? Because they were insurance, not a weapon. I told you that. The insurance is no longer necessary once I'm no longer... She paused. Once I'm no longer in a position where I need ground to stand on that isn't dependent on your regard for me. And the vendor companies. My subsidiaries will honor all existing contracts through their full terms. I have no interest in disrupting your operations. I never did. The monitoring. She was quiet for a moment. All records destroyed, she said. My attorney will provide a notarized certification. You have my word separately. He sat with all of that. The specific architecture of it, the care of it, every lever returned, every position unwound, clean exits, no residual damage. It was not the settlement of an adversary. It was the settlement of a person who had needed leverage to survive a situation and was now, having exited the situation, disposing of the leverage with the same precision she had used to assemble it. He thought about what it had cost her to assemble it. Not the money, the time, the sustained performance. 5 years of dinners and errand running and wearing the dresses he selected and absorbing the Tuesday nights and the dismissals and the particular vocabulary of a man who had decided on day one what she was and had never once revisited the decision. I owe you an apology, he said. The words came out at the same volume as everything else he had said. Flat, direct, without the architecture of performance. He had not rehearsed them. They arrived because they were the next true thing. Serafina looked at him. Her expression did not change immediately. Then it changed in the way of something that has been braced for a long time, being allowed to unbrace. A slight shift in the set of her jaw. A change behind the eyes. Damien, she said. I dismissed you, he said, for 5 years, systematically and casually, and without ever stopping to wonder if the picture I'd decided on was accurate. I said things to you that... He stopped, reorganized. The things I said, about your father, about what you had without me. Those weren't anger about other things. Those were what I actually believed, and I was wrong. And I don't know how to quantify what it cost you to sit in that and say nothing, but I understand now that it was significant and that I was the cause of it. The room was very quiet. That's not nothing, she said. Her voice was careful, the same phrase she had used that morning in the kitchen when he had said the same thing to her about her choice not to use the leverage she held. No, he said, it's not. She looked at him for a long time. He let her look. He didn't arrange his face or manage what was in it. I should have told you, she said eventually. Not all of it, not the full structure, not at the beginning, but somewhere in 5 years I should have found a way to tell you something real. She paused. I convinced myself the secrecy was entirely about business strategy. It wasn't entirely about that. Some of it was protection, from the possibility that you would see who I actually was and decide I was less, not more. He felt that land. I would have, he said, quiet and honest. In year 1, I would have. I don't know about later. She nodded slowly, as though she had known that and had needed to hear it confirmed. That's honest, she said. I'm trying, he said. I'm not very practiced at it. Something crossed her face that was not quite a smile, but was in the territory of one. Brief, real, the first genuinely unguarded expression he had seen on her face in days. No, she agreed. You're not. They sat with that for a moment, and it was the closest thing to an actual conversation they had managed in 5 years, and it was happening at the end of everything, which was the specific cruelty of certain kinds of learning, that it arrives too late to change the thing it might have changed. Patek. She brought the locket over at some point during the hour that followed, set it on the coffee table between them. He looked at it. My father gave it to me the last month of his life, she said. Inside is a note in his handwriting, 3 lines. She paused. He told me that the most important thing he had given me was not the money or the structure. It was the understanding that the way the world sees you and the way you actually are can be entirely different things, and that the distance between those two things is yours to manage, and that managing it well is a form of power that cannot be taken from you. Damien looked at the locket. You managed it well, he said. I managed it too completely, she said. There's a cost to being invisible, even when you choose it, even when it serves you. She looked at the locket. My father was invisible his whole life. He built something extraordinary, and no one who loved him ever fully knew him. I watched what that did to him in the last year. I swore I would not... She stopped. And then I built the same thing, inside your house. The same invisibility, just with better infrastructure. The honesty of that sat in the room between them like something that had been waiting a long time to be said. "What happens to you now?" he said. "What do you mean?" "Publicly. You've stepped into the light. 60 billion in assets, public profile, your name on a wall. What does that life look like?" She considered the question. "Louder?" she said. "More accountable. The Meridian technology goes into a public rollout within 18 months, which means press, which means attention. The Veil Horizon structure will be profiled in the financial press. I'll be asked to speak at things, sit on boards publicly rather than through nominees." She paused. "It's unfamiliar. The visibility." "You handled the room tonight," he said. "I've been preparing for that room for 11 years. It didn't look like preparation. It looked like you." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Simple, direct, without management." He nodded. They sat in the apartment for another hour, not talking continuously, talking and then sitting in quiet and then talking again, the rhythm of it unlike anything they had managed before, slower and less defended. He asked her about Meridian, about what she intended to do with the technology. She talked about it with a precision and a genuine animating interest that he had never heard in her voice across a dinner table, and he listened the way he had not listened for 5 years, which meant actually listening, following the detail rather than waiting for his turn. She asked him, at one point, about the early days of his network. Not the mechanics of it, the feeling of it. What it had been like to build something from the beginning when he was 22 with no infrastructure and no name behind him. He told her. He had not told anyone in years because he had not been in a conversation where it was relevant, and telling it now to her in this room felt like handing something over. Some small, true thing from before he had become what he had become. She listened. At 1 a.m, she stood. He stood. They were across the coffee table from each other, and the apartment was quiet, and the city was still going below the windows the way it always went, indifferent to the particular human reckoning happening 53 floors above it. "I'll have my attorney contact Carlotta next week," she said. "We'll keep it quiet. There's no reason for it to be public." "No," he agreed. "I'll be out of this apartment by the end of the month. I have a place in the West Village. I've had it for 2 years. I'll manage the transition so it doesn't—" She paused. "So it doesn't cause you difficulties." He looked at her. "Serafina," he said. She waited. "Take what you need," he said. "Don't manage the transition for my benefit. Just take what you need." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. She picked up the locket from the coffee table, held it in her palm for a moment, then she held it out to him. He looked at it. "Why?" he said. "Because the note inside says something you should read," she said. "Not for me, for yourself." A pause. "My father wrote it for me, but I think he was also writing it for men like you." He took the locket. It was lighter than he expected, warm from where she had held it. He did not open it yet. She walked down the hall to the master bedroom. The door closed. Not hard, not soft. Just the ordinary sound of a door finding its frame. He stood in the living room with the locket in his hand for a long time. Then he sat down and opened it. The note was on a piece of paper so small it had been folded 4 times to fit the locket's interior. Edmund Vale's handwriting was small and even, the handwriting of a man who had learned to compress things into spaces they might not naturally fit. 3 lines. "The empire is not what you build. It is what you become while building it. Make sure you would recognize yourself at the end." Damien sat with the note open in his palm. The apartment was quiet around him. Somewhere down the hall, a light was still on, the thin line of it visible under the door, and then it went out. He sat in the dark. He thought about what he would recognize in himself standing at the end of 20 years. The architecture of what he had built was vast and intricate, and had required from him a sustained, relentless focus that had consumed most of what he had. He had given it his attention, his calculation, his willingness to do what other people would not do in pursuit of the positions he needed to hold. He had given it, he understood now, sitting in the dark with a dead man's 3 lines in his hand, the parts of himself that might have been used for other purposes, for actual looking, for genuine attention, for the kind of curiosity about another person that makes them real to you rather than functional. He had built an empire. He had not recognized himself in it for a long time. He did not know if that was changeable. He was 41, and the habits of 20 years were not soft things, not the kinds of things that reshape themselves in a single night because a woman had handed you a locket and walked down a hallway. He knew himself well enough to know that the man who would come out of this apartment tomorrow and the day after would still be the man who had made the choices he had made, who carried the architecture of those choices in his body and his instincts and the way he read a room. But he had spent the evening sitting in a chair in a room full of people who were standing, and he had let it be what it was instead of making it into something he could control. And that was small, and it was real, and it was the first genuinely new thing he had done in a very long time. He folded the note back along its four folds, set it in the locket, set the locket on the table. He sat in the apartment and let the night move past him. She left on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the gala. She had told him the day before, matter of fact, the way she handled practical information. A car at 10. 4 cases, some boxes that had been packed over the previous week. She was leaving the furniture because she had her own. She was leaving the household arrangements intact because they had always, as both of them acknowledged without saying it directly, been hers to manage, which meant he would need to figure out how to manage them for himself. He was not in the apartment when she left. This was a choice they had made without discussing it, a mutual recognition that the practical fact of the departure did not require an audience. He was in the office on the 38th floor, working through the morning's operational review, when Vasile came to the door at 11:15 and said, simply, that the car had departed. Damien nodded. He looked at the document in front of him. He read the same sentence 3 times without retaining it. He put the document down and looked at the midtown skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows and allowed himself, for perhaps 4 minutes, to feel what was in him without organizing it into anything actionable. It was a formless and uncomfortable thing, the compound of loss and recognition and the specific exhaustion that comes from having seen yourself clearly after a long period of not looking. It was not grief exactly. It was something adjacent to it, something that shared a border with regret without being entirely that either. It was, he thought, the particular weight of arriving at an understanding too late to use it the way you might have used it. He allowed himself 4 minutes. Then he picked up the document and read it properly this time, and retained it, and moved into the day. Bam. The dissolution was quiet. Carlotta and Serafina's attorney handled the paperwork over 6 weeks with the kind of clinical efficiency that large, uncomplicated financial separations could achieve when both parties wanted it clean. The debt instruments were returned to the issuing banks within 30 days, as she had said they would be. The vendor company contracts ran their full terms without incident. Petrov's monitoring files were certified destroyed by a third-party forensic firm whose certification Carlotta reviewed and confirmed satisfactory. The financial press ran 3 profiles of Veil Horizon Group over the following 2 months. Serafina gave 2 interviews, both long and substantive, both conducted with the precision and directness that had characterized her 7 minutes at the gala podium. In one of them, the interviewer asked about her personal life, and she answered briefly, recently separated, no comment beyond that, and moved the conversation back to the Meridian technology rollout with the ease of someone who had decided what she would and would not offer, and was entirely comfortable with the decision. Damien read both interviews. He read them the way he had spent 5 years not looking at her, actually looking, following the detail, attending to what she was actually saying rather than what he expected her to say. What he found in both of them was a mind that was original and precise and entirely uninterested in performing anything for anyone's benefit, a mind that had been in the room with him for 5 years and that he had chosen, repeatedly, not to engage. He put both interviews in a folder. He did not examine why. The Meridian Water Technologies rollout began 6 months after the gala. The first municipal contract, a desalination partnership with a port city on the Mediterranean coast, was announced on a Tuesday morning in a press release that ran in 37 financial publications and 4 general news outlets. The technology, Caleb Mercer explained in an interview conducted from the Red Hook facility, had the potential to provide clean water infrastructure to communities that had been dependent on failing systems for decades. The Veil Horizon backing, he said, had made the difference between a promising patent and an actual deployment. Damien read the announcement in the morning review. He sat with it for a moment longer than he sat with most items in the review. Then he made a note on the tablet, a private note. In the folder he did not examine. She built the right thing. 3 words. He deleted them after a moment because they were not operational information. Then he retyped them because they were true. He left them there. So, 9 months after this gala, on a Tuesday evening in November, Damien came home to the penthouse and stood in the entryway and looked at the apartment in the way you look at places you have lived alone long enough that the original meaning of them has receded and been replaced by something simpler and less furnished. The apartment was clean. The household manager came 3 times a week. The kitchen was stocked. The operational surface of his life ran with the same efficiency it had always run, because he had learned to maintain the machinery of his own existence, which was something he had been slow to understand was his own responsibility, rather than a feature of the environment he inhabited. The console table in the entryway was bare except for a dish for keys. The candle was gone. It had been hers, one of the small choices she made about the atmosphere of the space she lived in, and when she left it had gone with her as it should have. He missed the candle. This was a small, ridiculous thing. He was aware it was small and ridiculous. He had spent 20 years building a criminal financial network across the eastern seaboard, and his primary experience of loss was the absence of a candle on a console table. The absurdity of it did not make it less real. He went to the kitchen and made coffee, stood at the island while it brewed. On the counter where she had kept her notebook, there was nothing. There had been nothing there for 9 months. He had not replaced it with anything because it was not his space to fill. He poured the coffee. He stood at the window in the kitchen and looked at the city the way he had looked at it every morning for years, and for the first time in recent memory, the looking had a different quality. Not the satisfaction of possession, not the dull automaticity of a habit that had outlasted its meaning, but something more uncertain and more awake. The city was still there. It was still vast and indifferent and full of the machinery of other people's ambitions and the slow compounding of choices made across years. He was still inside it and still operating inside it and still, by most measures, powerful within it. But the floor had moved. Months ago it had moved, and it had not moved back. And he had been walking on the new surface since then, finding his footing, learning the changed geography of a life that had been stripped of certain assumptions he had not known he was standing on until they were gone. He was still learning. He thought about Edmund Vail's 3 lines. The empire is not what you build. It is what you become while building it. He drank his coffee. He stood at the window. The city offered him nothing in particular, which was all it ever offered anyone, which was, in its way, the honest thing about it. It did not promise, it did not comfort, it simply continued, enormous and uninterested, the same for everyone, showing nothing but what was actually there. He thought about the woman in the sapphire gown walking into a room and being, finally, entirely herself. He thought about what that had cost her to reach, and what it looked like when someone arrived at it. He stood at the window for a long time. Then he set down the coffee cup, picked up his phone, and opened a document he had been building for 6 weeks, a restructuring outline for the legitimate holdings of his network, a slow and legally intricate process that would, if he followed it through, move the center of his operations from where it had always been toward something that could survive in the actual light of day. It was not a simple thing. It was not a clean thing. There were years of structure to unwind and years of different structure to build, and no guarantee of what waited on the other side of it. But it was the next true thing. He began to read it. Outside, the city went on. The harbor caught the light of 1,000 buildings and threw it back in broken pieces, the same as it always had, the same as it would tomorrow, indifferent to the particular man 53 floors above it, who was sitting with a document and a cold cup of coffee, and the slowly arriving understanding that the most significant empire he would ever need to build was the one that looked back at him when the room was empty and the deals were done and the noise had finally gone quiet. He had work to do. He started from the beginning.